Yes, I know. There's
All right, we are continuing on this look at the foreign policy and diplomatic history. Last time, I tried to give you a sense of this change from the old diplomacy, how we used to react and deal with or interact with other countries, and the basic understanding was that we sort of set back and let the world come to us. And we could do that, again, with the luxury of geography, Pacific and the Atlantic Ocean, a certain sense of isolation, and a feeling of we weren't really vulnerable or threatened. That all begins to change with industrialization and all of the new technology that industrialization provided. So the world began to get much smaller. Communications, transportation, the speed at which you had to respond to situations or be able to respond to situations. But ultimately, it's economics. It's going to be the demand, the necessity to get American manufactured goods into foreign markets. So this is what I mean by industrialization forced us, unless we want to go back to a pre-industrial society, which we weren't, it forces us to get out into the world in a way we had never done before, right? So we had to actually start implementing or thinking about foreign policy in a significant way for the first time. And I gave you a couple of examples of that last time with Samoa, with the Venezuelan boundary dispute. Again, Venezuela, we didn't care about the gold or who got it. We just wanted to be the ones to determine who got it. That's a projection of power. And that's really what the United States is most interested in here, is this economic and political power on the world stage, right? We are an emerging world power in the late 19th and early 20th century. Now, we're not a superpower. We won't be a superpower until after World War II. That's down the road a little ways. But it was the demands of economic growth caused by industrialization that forces us out into the world in a way we have. So we ended last time with a very brief look about the annexation of the Hawaiian Islands. And I had one more slide I was going to show you here to kind of wrap that up. Again, you can always count on political cartoons to kind of get to the heart of a message here with this. Just a couple of images. We have a Hawaiian princess being forced to marry. Can you tell who that is?
Uncle Sam.
Uncle Sam, right? Again, this is another shotgun wedding, and of course President McKinley is overseeing the ceremonies here. And the point here is another shotgun wedding with neither party willing, right? We annexed the Hawaiian Islands. We're going to officially annex them in 1898, but the writing was on the wall here because we're gearing up for a war against Spain. And if we're going to deal with Spain, this means you don't deal with just the nation of Spain. That's not the issue. And the irony of the Spanish-American War is that the United States goes to war against Spain in the Caribbean and the Pacific. Okay? So it's not a war where the United States and Spain themselves are going to fight on each other's country, but it is about empire. It is about control of territory and colonial possessions. Right? So the Spanish-American War is what we want to primarily focus upon today. Okay? Now, the other thing I was trying to indicate is that, last time, is that a lot of times historians suggest that the Spanish-American War is this first real example of the new diplomacy in action, and prior to that it was the old diplomacy. And again, it's usually, history doesn't work. It's usually not that neat and compact that we have kind of a before and after moment here. We are slowly implementing the new policy, right? And again, the demands of industrialization is what's forcing us to do this. So the Spanish-American War is definitely an example of the new diplomacy. It's the most important example because it's really after the Spanish-American War that we acquired a significant amount of real estate around the world, particularly in the Caribbean islands and in the Pacific near Asia, the Philippine Islands. Okay? So just a little background to this conflict here. The old Spanish Empire, back to the time of Columbus and the conquistadors in the New World, has much been reduced. There's not much of it left. The nations in South America, and Central America had largely rebelled and gone through their independence movements back in the early 19th century. But Spain still possesses a lot of islands. And most importantly, it's Cuba. Cuba and the Philippines are going to be the two islands or island nations that we are concerned with. Okay? So Cuba was possessed by the controlled, occupied by Spain. But there was this movement in Cuba amongst the Cuban people for independence. They want to free themselves of their imperial masters here, the Spanish, and they had been appealing to the United States in some very direct and bold manners, trying to, how do you say this, play upon the sympathies of the American people. Because notice the language they use, right? We are a people possessed and controlled by a brutal empire. We want independence. We want our liberty. Surely the American people can understand this cause here, as we had thrown off our own imperial masters, the British, in our revolution, or War of Independence, not a revolution, back in the 1780s, right? So I think in many ways, the American people are quite happy to help people when we believe, and that's the key here, when we believe we're doing it for moral and ethical reasons, not imperial, economic, political reasons, right? So the sympathies of the American people, we're going to get our heartstrings tugged on here just a little bit, and there is some concern for helping the Cubans liberate themselves, right? How many times have we heard that before? To go liberate people from oppressive regimes and governments, right? Now, to help this along, this tugging at the heartstrings of the American people, we have to consider a specifically, how do I say this, a type of journalism or media influence called yellow journalism. And at the heart of this is a guy you've at least heard of the award named after him, Joseph Pulitzer. He is a newspaperman, right? And he, along with his chief competitor, William Randolph Hearst, are very much engaged in what we call yellow journalism. And if you want an example of yellow journalism in a contemporary setting today, just watch Fox News, okay? Just watch MSNBC, all right? These are highly sensationalized, mostly editorial comments. It's not really news in any way. It's usually designed to stir up sensational stories and headlines and bold images. For what purpose?
For getting people riled up.
Not so much to get people riled up, although they're happy if that's a side product.
Get people to believe what they would like.
More basic than that.
Money, just
Okay, money, but in the form of
ratings.
ratings. This is about commercial advertising, and if it's more sensationalized news, people tend to pay attention to that, or at least check it out, right? Fox News is the #1 most watched, scary as that sounds, news network in the United States. Okay? So the same thing is happening here. It is about selling newspapers more than anything else. It's a circulation war. And they're trying to drum up business by tugging at the heartstrings of the American people. And what they're really focusing on, and just to give you an example of this, William Randolph Hearst very famously said, "You provide the pictures, and I'll provide the story." Right? That is, we don't really need to worry about fact-checking and whether our facts are all exactly correct. We just need to get to the heart of the story here, and the purpose, again, is to sell newspapers. Now, in this particular instance, this plays a really important role in influencing us. As we were saying, the other side of this is influencing, or at least shaping, American opinion about what's going on in Cuba. Okay? Now, what is going on in Cuba? Well, Cuba, again, as I said, there's an independence movement there. But Spain, like all empires, are not interested in losing territory. They're going to fight to maintain that. And so what the Spanish began to do is implement policies of extreme brutality on the Cuban people. it is fair to say that they implemented what we would call today concentration camps. They literally rounded up thousands of people, mass starvation, torture, murder, violence, human atrocities, crimes against humanity, however you want to say that. They absolutely brutalized the Cuban people as an effort to put down this independence and rebellion movement in Cuba. Okay? So from that perspective, these are the stories that are being told back in the United States. And again, to be fair, they're not exactly exaggerating a whole lot of that. But there is also an agenda here for war. An agenda here for, again, well, economic expansion versus liberating people from an independence movement. Okay? So, for example, what's going to happen here is we have an incident in which the United States, now this is, again, 1898, and the president is William McKinley. And he sent the USS Maine. This is a battleship, part of the American battle fleet here that we remember we started building navies. We sent this battleship down to Cuba in Havana, in the harbor in Havana, as a show of force. Right? This is a projection of power. That is, we can use this on Spain if we need to. Right? So it was an attempt to try to maybe calm some of the tension down there by saying that the United States is going to play a role in determining the outcome here, right? Well, the problem is that this battleship exploded in the harbor and sunk. Now, what is the, how do we say this here? This becomes, the war cry becomes, remember the Maine, to hell with Spain. Right? And this kind of drumbeat now becomes justified, at least in the minds of some Americans, because we have now been attacked by the Spanish. Now, did we actually bother to investigate the cause of this incident? No. We do eventually, but we do that all the time. Eventually we get around to it, and then we come back to find out the real reason was an accident on board the ship itself. Okay? But the belief was, and at least what's being promoted by guys like Pulitzer and guys like William Randolph Hearst, is that it was the harbor was deliberately mined by the Spanish to sink this ship. Well, now we have just cause to go to war. Okay? And the question that we have to think about here in terms of, what is our purpose? Is it Cuban independence? Or what is that new diplomacy all about? Access to foreign markets, economic expansion. Remember that Cuba is ripe for a tremendous amount of agricultural produce, most importantly sugar, right? Again, we saw what happened in Hawaii, the overthrow of a rightful, legitimate government, simply to make money by including Hawaii as part of the United States to avoid taxes, right? So this becomes the sort of battle cry here of remembering the Maine and going to war against Spain. Okay? Now, there was a lot of people in the United States who disagreed with this. Right? People that we would put in the anti-imperialist camp that absolutely opposed going to war with Spain, particularly if it had any kind of economic incentive or motivations. So in our, again, Congress is going to submit what do we call those things? Wartime appropriations bill is what I'm trying to say here. That is to fund the war. And attached to these wartime appropriations bills going before Congress that gives the United States military and the president the authority to use force is attached an amendment called the Teller Amendment. And what the Teller Amendment said is that the United States has no interest in occupying or possessing Cuba when this conflict is over. So it was basically added to the wartime appropriations bill to calm the fears and concerns of the anti-imperialists that somehow we had an agenda to take control of the island. Okay? So with that added to it, it appears that our main motivation, on the surface at least, was to liberate the Cuban people. Right? Well, the first action of the war between the United States against Spain over the island of Cuba is to attack the Philippines. Okay? Now, why are we attacking the Philippines? Because when you go to war with a country like this, or like Spain, you go to war with all of its imperial possessions, right? When Great Britain goes to war, the British Empire goes to war. Okay? That's the purpose of empire. So this is the map we want to look at here for just a moment, because off the coast of China, we have the majority, the bulk of the United States Navy, right? Commanded by Commodore Dewey. And Dewey is going to attack the Spanish Navy in the Philippines to make sure that they will not pose a threat to us, right? Now, in this particular incident here at Manila Bay, the Spanish Navy is caught off guard, and the United States completely destroyed the entire Navy without any losses to the United States, right? It's a complete lopsided victory here, and from this point forward, the Spanish Navy will pose no threat whatsoever to the United States, both here as well as back in Cuba, right? And this was one of the headlines here of Dewey in Manila Bay in the Philippines here, where it was a complete rout. The Spanish Navy was no match for this new, remember, brand new, modern United States naval fleet, right? Perhaps third or fourth in the world at this time. Okay, so the Navy is now taken care of. From the Spanish Navy is now taken care of. Back to Cuba. Okay. Well, this is where we need to go back just a little bit to Teddy Roosevelt, or TR, as he's oftentimes referred to, Teddy Roosevelt, and the Rough Riders. Now, remember what I said about this idea that you need to prove yourself in battle to show that you're a real man, right? These sort of gender definitions become very prominent in the late 19th century in the United States here, and nobody embodied that more than Theodore. He was itching for a fight, right? And in fact, he said to one of his confidants, "In strict confidence, I should welcome almost any war, for I think this country needs one." Now, did we need a war? Well, I suppose that's to be debated, right? But he certainly believed it, as did many, many Americans. Remember, this guy is going to go on to become one of the most popular presidents in American history. He's not, at this point, he is the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Not real power, but he resigned that position. He gave it up. He quit so he could go fight in this war. And he formed what's called the Rough Riders. This was, be very clear, they put them in uniforms, but see where it says US, on a USV? What does the V stand for? He's a volunteer. This is not the professional army. This is a militia group. It's basically cavalrymen, led by Teddy Roosevelt, right? And in fact, when he gets down to Cuba, he and the Rough Riders were, how should we say this? They were a thorn in the side of the regular army the entire time they're there. Because Teddy Roosevelt is racing all over the island, engaging the enemy, causing problems, not telling the regular army what he's doing, and getting a lot of people killed in the process. Remember what his mission is, to prove himself in battle, right? Now, he and the Rough Riders do play a pretty important role in the capturing of San Juan Hill, right? This is that famous charge up San Juan Hill. And in doing this, it did bring about the end of the war. So they do play a decisive role here in conjunction with the regular army at the end of the war. This war, by the way, lasted about 6 weeks to 8 weeks. Maybe about 2 months or so, roughly speaking, in terms of major military action. Not terribly complicated here from the United States perspective, all right? And here's his attitude, I think, that sums so much of what this, when I talk about gender definitions here, what it means to be a man. No triumph of peace is quite so great as the supreme triumphs of war. Now, if you have a guy like that as president, you can expect more conflicts. And we're going to have more conflicts with him as president later on. All right? Now, here's what's important about this. We have a tradition of electing war heroes to the presidency. It goes back to George Washington. Most of the time, they are much better military commanders than they are political leaders. Right? He is going to definitely be the exception to that. He'll be much better president than he was a military leader, but he's not really a military leader to begin with. Right? This is kind of a writing club. That is basically all it was here. But notice, you remember what we talked about with George Armstrong Custer and the fact that he got promoted so quickly during the Civil War because he led these spectacular charges against the Confederacy, charges that probably never should have happened. And a lot of good men died as a result of that. Why? So he could be promoted. That's exactly what he was doing here as well. He is trying to make a name for himself and prove his manliness in battle. Right? And as a result of this, again, he obviously makes it all the way to the White House. When he comes back from this war, he is elected the governor of New York, and then immediately in the election of 1900, during the war it's still, McKinley runs for president again, and he becomes the vice president. Now the irony of that is, in 1901, McKinley is assassinated, and now he is president. As his political opponents at the time said, that damn cowboy is now president. Right? Now, just to give you a sense, as I was saying, in terms of the just overwhelming amount of racism going on here, remember back to that annexation of Hawaii situation. Roosevelt's response to that when we failed to annex them the first time, he said it was, quote, a crime against the white race. Right? So again, this is an era that really promoted and celebrated racial superiority of Anglo-Saxons, as we've already talked about. And again, this is only going to re-emphasize it time and time again here, the success against the Spanish, against the Cubans, against the Filipinos. Right? Now, when the war is over in Cuba, remember that Teller Amendment? You know, we're not going to take over Cuba. We have no interest. Well, wow, did that seem like we kind of rushed into that all of a sudden? And they kind of get out the white marker there, the white out, and they get rid of it. And when the new Cuban Constitution is written, we insert what's called the Platt Amendment, which said that the United States has the right to intervene in Cuban foreign policy. More or less, we'll kind of let you run your show here locally, but as it affects U.S. interests abroad, we will intervene whenever we feel it's necessary, right? And when you implement this into their constitution, it sort of gives it this legal credibility. But what is it? It's a projection of power that the United States is going to determine the course of events in Cuba, right? So Cuba becomes a U.S. protectorate. Now, we don't quite annex it the same way as we do Hawaii, but it becomes basically a U.S. possession, right? So why do we have Guantanamo Bay today? It goes back to our early occupation of the island after this war, right? Now, here's the question we want to think about. Remember I said that this war is 1898 to 1902. 4 years this war lasts. Yet, we defeated the Spanish in Cuba in about two and a half months. Where's the rest of the war? Well, it's in the Philippines. Remember, this is a global conflict here. I mean, on a small scale, global conflict, because you're dealing with Spanish territories around the world. And the Philippines is going to be the source of fighting for the next 3.5 years. Because when we defeated the Spanish Navy, and we are posturing for war to liberate Cuba and give them independence, that's what the Teller Amendment was about, then we are going to, the belief was that the same thing was going to happen in the Philippines. And the leader of the Philippine independence movement was a man named Emilio Aguinaldo. And as the Spanish Navy was defeated, and it appears that the United States has more or less defeated Spain in the Philippines, they begin figuring out how to create a new Filipino constitution under an independent Philippines. But we have different plans in mind for the Philippines. Notice there wasn't a Teller Amendment that said we wouldn't occupy the Philippines. It was kind of ambiguous. Well, now here's an opportunity. And what we are going to do is put down Aguinaldo's, what we would call today, and this is very reminiscent of what's been going on, a Filipino insurgency. We take possession of the islands and spend the next 3.5 years putting down the Filipino independence movement. We are going to make sure that we maintain possession of this island. That's what empires do. Now, the problem here is how we do it. How many of you have ever heard of the Filipino-American War? Yeah, 2 hands. You guys didn't get this in high school? No. And notice how even when we present it, we still present it as this little sub-story of the Spanish-American War, right? Where we went to war to liberate Cuba against the atrocities of those barbaric Spaniards. What do we do in the Philippines? Well, fighting insurgencies is very difficult, as we have experienced over the last few years, right? And it is, again, guerrilla warfare, hit and run, ambush. This is a very difficult type of war to wage, right? Now, it's very interesting attitudes about the Philippines. We want to think just a little bit here about what is our real interest in the Philippines? Why are we doing this, right? Well, here's what President McKinley said, okay? He's talking to a group of ministers in the White House that are visiting, and he talks about his decision about what to do with the Philippines. He said, before you go, I'd like to say just a few words about the Philippine business. The truth is, I didn't want the Philippines, right? I mean, we never want these things. But when they came to us as a gift from the gods, I did not know what to do with them. I sought counsel, but got little help. I thought first we'd only take Manila, then Luzon, then the other islands, right? I walked the floor of the White House night after night until midnight, right? He's really worried about this. And I'm not ashamed to tell you, gentlemen, that I went down on my knees and prayed Almighty God for light and guidance more than once. And one night it came to me. Number one, that we could not give them back to Spain, for that would be cowardly and dishonorable. Number two, we could not turn them over to France or Germany, our commercial rivals in the Orient. That would be bad business. Number three, that we could not leave them to themselves, for they were unfit for government, self-government, and they would soon have anarchy and misrule. They're not capable of governing themselves, right? Number four, right, and you see where we're going with this, we have no choice. That there was nothing left for us to do but to take them all and to educate the Filipinos and uplift and civilize and Christianize them, and by God's grace do the very, very best we could with them. And as for our fellow men for whom Christ also died, and then I went to bed and slept soundly. We didn't want the Philippines. There's just no choice here. After all, when you are dealing with Orientals, which, again, a racist term, you are dealing with children. These people are not fit for self-government, right? Now, Aguinaldo might have disagreed with that as he's preparing to, create this new constitution in the Philippines. Interesting, this term, to Christianize them. Now, remember what the other aspect of the new diplomacy is. One, it's economics, and two, it's missionary work. The problem is that the Philippines have been Christian for 400 years, longer than the United States has been around. But what kind of Christian? That bad Catholic stuff. That's Spain, right? Remember, it's Protestant Christianity that's important. White Anglo-Saxon Protestantism, right? So they don't even recognize the fact that these people are Christian longer than the United States has existed. Okay? And as McKinley goes on to say, too, tapping into that racism, it was to educate and uplift, as he said, our brown little brothers. And they don't say something like that and think, like I just said something wrong, right? Like we hopefully would say today, think there's something wrong with saying that. That's just common accepted beliefs and attitudes of Anglo-Saxon superiority, right? Now, how do you deal with an insurgency, right? How do you fight this war? Well, this is not an easy thing to do. The Secretary of War, that would be the Secretary of Defense today. Right? Sounds much better to be Secretary of Defense than Secretary of War. Right? The Elihu Root was his name, said, "The war in the Philippines has been conducted by the American Army with scrupulous regard for the rules of civilized warfare, with self-restraint, and with humanity never surpassed." Okay, that's somebody from Washington. How about somebody on the ground in the Philippines watching what the American Army is doing to the Philippine people? The report says, "The present war is no bloodless. Our men have been relentless, have killed to exterminate men, women, children, prisoners and captives, active insurgents, suspected people from lads of 10 up. The idea prevailing that the Filipino as such was little better than a dog. Our soldiers have pumped salt water into men to make them talk." What do we call that? Waterboarding. That's not a recent issue. We've been doing that for a long time. And have taken prisoners people who held up their hands and peacefully surrendered, and an hour later, without an atom of evidence to show that they were even insurrectos, stood them on a bridge and shot them down one by one to drop into the water below and float down, as examples to those who found their bullet-loaded corpse. I'm not sure that that's humanity unsurpassed from the perspective of the Filipinos. Why do we not talk about this war? Because we acted badly in this war. And we don't remember, history is the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. We don't want to talk about insurgency and waterboarding and the atrocities. Because what did we do to the Filipino people? We rounded them up, we put them in camps, we tortured them, we murdered them. Does this sound familiar? Yeah. The same thing that the Spanish did to the Cubans that justified our involvement in the war, we turned around and did to the Philippine people. Now, what brings this to an end? Most of the time, insurgencies are often held together by the personality of their leaders, and Emilio Aguinaldo was captured, executed, and the insurgency fell apart. Right? So, a very interesting cartoon here to kind of wrap up a little bit of what's going on. I'm not sure how you can see this or not, but get a sense of the American Empire here at the dawn of the 20th century, right? Take a look at this cartoon. So here's Uncle Sam, right? Gonna tell everybody how it's supposed to be, I guess. I mean, you know how professors are. Cuba, right? Just look at these kids. Cuba, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, the Philippines, right? These are all the bad kids, right? Notice in the back, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, Native American, back in the corner here. Not, right? Look, the book is upside down. Savages don't even know how to read. Look over in the corner. We have our African Americans doing all this nice little labor we need them to do to keep things clean. Don't even let the Chinese in, right? Keep them on the outs. Again, these kind of cartoons sometimes capture exactly what's going on in a very succinct manner, in ways that hours of lecturing about this stuff can't do. Right? This is a projection of power, but notice the inherent superiority, racism, religious superiority that is going on here. Right? This is the aspects of the foundation of American empire here. As we are projecting our power to the world, we are primarily doing it against people we would consider to be inferior and weaker to us, right? In essence, we're picking on smaller countries. And in doing this, the purpose is economic expansion, new diplomacy, access to these markets. Now, one of the bigger questions that we want to think about, these are American soldiers in the Filipino-American War. One of the things that was really interesting, if you want to kind of bring this home in terms of the impact of racism, there are a lot of African American soldiers fighting in the American Army in the Philippines. And notice what they are experiencing. As African Americans, they are completely segregated in the military. They are continually called the N-word over and over again. And then they see the white soldiers and how their attitude and actions and the way they're talking about the Filipinos, right? It was a time of intense racism in the United States. In the years between 1889 and 1903, on the average, every week, 2 African Americans were lynched by mobs. Now, this is back in the United States: Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina. Hanged, burned, mutilated. The Filipinos were brown-skinned, physically identifiable, strange-speaking, strange-looking to white Americans. To the usual indiscriminate brutality of war was this added the factor of racial hostility. So when African-American soldiers fighting against our brown little brothers, they began to see that they have more in common with the Filipinos and the way that they're being treated than they did with the white soldiers in the army, to the point where African-American soldiers began to desert the American army and join the other side. Right? So again, this racism is just ever present through wherever we go. Right? Now, one of the things we want to think about here, just in terms of expansion and empire, Pacific and the Caribbean, is, okay, so here's the Philippines. What was our real motivation for the Philippines? It's not even the Philippines. What's right next to the Philippines? China. You think that there are markets in Cuba and the Philippines? You're talking about 400 million people in early 20th century China. That's the goal, is China. The Philippines are a stepping stone to China, right? So we issued, notice the timing of all of this, in 1899, right as we are conducting warfare to take possession of the Philippines. We send to China what's called the, two letters, they're diplomatic letters, but it's called the open door policy. Now China was a very politically weak country at the turn of the century. They are dominated by European empires, particularly the Germans, the French, less so by the Russians to the north, the Japanese, and to some degree the British with places like Hong Kong, right? And amongst these European powers, there is some discussion about maybe we should just break China up completely, right? And create these what's called spheres of influence, areas that you control outside of your own territory, that you can direct and control what goes on there. Now remember what the purpose of colonies are, or territorial possessions. It is about control. So these are not open markets. The whole point is to extract wealth and exploit the wealth there for your own country, back home, right? So China is in a really awkward and difficult situation because they have almost no control or very little control about the political direction of their country. It is very close to literally being carved up and wiped off the map, or tremendously reduced as these European powers begin to exert their power and influence. Here comes the United States. We issue what's called the open door policy. These are, again, diplomatic letters we are sent to the Chinese government, but also to the European powers in China. And basically what we are saying, and just notice how the language here is, you never really say what your real agenda is, right? You have to make it much more open and inclusive of everybody. We are basically demanding that the markets in China be open. There should be open access to the market in China for all nations. Now, by all nations, we mean us, okay? And here's a very interesting aspect of the power of the United States economically. It's not the Chinese that have to agree to this. They don't have the choice. It's going to be the other European powers that have to respond to this. And specifically, England, Germany, France, they are in an awkward position now too. They can say no to this and keep their markets closed, but if they do, they risk disrupting trade patterns back to Germany, back to Europe, back to England, from the United States. Remember, at this point, we are the largest industrialized economy in the world. It is economic pressure that we bring to bear in China here. And notice what else we get to say. We're not in China. We're not occupying any of China. We didn't come in and take over any of this territory, economically or politically or militarily. But notice where we are. We're right there on the Philippines, so that we have our foot in the door and still get to take the moral high ground. Because after all, we just want trade for everybody. meaning us. Right? And what's the result? They back down, and these markets begin to allow the United States access. Right? Remember, for good or for bad, industrialization forces us to reach out in a very determined manner to the rest of the world in a way we've never done before. Now, flash forwarding just a little bit, I want to talk, at least from this perspective, or this topic, conclude with the Panama Canal situation. This issue begins in 1904, and the president at this time is Theodore Roosevelt. Remember, he was the vice president under McKinley, and McKinley was assassinated in 1901. He became president then. And in 1904, he will run for election on his own and win a landslide election. He's a very popular president. Teddy Roosevelt is really the first president to, what we would say, usher in the modern presidency, where he made himself the center of attention. The spotlight is now firmly on the president in terms of national politics. Remember that Gilded Age politics? It was Congress, and the presidents tended to take a back seat, right? Roosevelt doesn't take a back seat to anybody, okay? And so he ushers in the modern presidency. And from that point forward in the 20th century, presidents are the center of American politics at the national level, all right? So he is going to... Now, the thing about Roosevelt, it's a mixed bag in terms of trying to analyze this guy. Because on the one hand, remember, he's a progressive president. Getting the government involved in regulation. Remember, he's the one that created the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, for oversight of corporations, particularly for consumer protection. He's the one that broke up a few very important attempts at monopolies and trusts, like Northern Securities with J.P. Morgan. He was the one that said it is better for the government to help a poor man make a living for his family than a rich man profits for his company or his corporation, right? So in many ways, Roosevelt is, and remember, he comes from elite society. He comes from the very rich. He's Republican, but he's really this very interesting character because on the one hand, he seems to have this rather progressive, forward-linking, compassion and expansion for the average person. But you put him in foreign policy, and he is a completely different animal. Again, as I said, it was a crime against the white race, white people, because we didn't take Hawaii, right? He's down there getting his men killed, not intentionally, but rather recklessly, just so he can promote his own personality. Excuse me. So he gets involved in Panama. Now, this is also one of the big issues in the Kinzer book that you should be reading on overthrow here, because the Panama Canal, while it makes sense to us today, why the canal would go there, just in terms of geography, the narrowest point, this isthmus connecting North and South America, it wasn't the first choice. Nicaragua was going to be another choice for a canal as well. But the point is that it was about, the Panama Canal really brings up an important aspect of American foreign policy called the Roosevelt corollary, all right? And basically what is happening here in Panama is that at the time, Panama is not an independent country. Panama was part of Colombia. It was a province of Colombia, the nation of Colombia. And Colombia is not interested in a canal because their fear was that this would allow the United States to have too much influence in their country. Now, as a result of that, Roosevelt goes to the Panamanians, the people in Colombia but in Panama, that are interested in independence from Colombia. Now, here's what the Roosevelt corollary is going to say. When we say a corollary, it just means an addendum or an addition to something else. It's an addendum to the Monroe Doctrine. Monroe Doctrine said that the United States will govern the affairs of countries in the Western Hemisphere who can't govern them themselves. Well, the Roosevelt corollary takes that one step further, that the United States, and it's important to get this down, the United States has the right to intervene in the internal struggles of foreign nations if it is in our interest. Now, what is our interest? Our interest is a canal. What do? We go to the Panamanians and said, if you will support our efforts to build the canal, we will support your efforts for independence. And Roosevelt helps foment a rebellion in Panama to liberate Panama from Colombia so that we can get our canal. It is in our interest, so we intervene in the internal struggles of another country. And by the way, that is the theme of the book Overthrow, is time and time again how the United States will intervene in local affairs where it is in our interest. Now again, we always do this under the guise of liberating people or promoting democracy or winning the hearts of... But really what it is about is promoting U.S. interests, right? And unfortunately, time and time again, we often will violate what we claim to be our own principles, like democracy itself, in these countries around the world to promote economic and political advantage. Okay? So we are going to create, or not create, but encourage a rebellion in Panama because it is in our interest. And what does Roosevelt say to justify this? Well, this is in the interest of all nations here for expediting commercial travel through the Panamanian Canal. And by all countries, once again, he means us. Okay? So, the United States, as a result of, again, big picture industrialization, is going to force us to get out in the world in a way we've never done. And by the way, U.S. right to intervene in internal affairs of foreign nation, what if it's in our interest to, I don't know, engage in preemptive strikes against the country because we think they might do something that would threaten us or threaten our security or threaten our economic hold over certain markets, right? This becomes a justification for a tremendous amount of violence that we're going to see characterize most of the 20th century in very small little ways that unfortunately most Americans do not get told about because we don't like to talk about those things. If we did them here in the United States, we would have people put in prison. But we do it abroad, and we turn a blind eye to it because we don't know much about it. Right? Okay, this is a brief look then at the development of foreign policy, new diplomacy, and our involvement in the world in a way we hadn't been before. Does anybody have any questions about that? Yes?
Right when we left off that last class, you said in 1898, the Hawaiian Islands were finally annexed, and then at the very beginning of the lecture you said 1897.
Well, 1897 was the date of that cartoon.
Oh, okay.
It was the date of the cartoon because the point was it was pretty clear this was going to happen. Right?
Okay.
That's all I was trying to indicate. Yeah, the date itself was the publication of the cartoon, but we formally annexed them in 1898. Okay. Any other questions about new diplomacy? No. Okay, well, I got done a little sooner than I thought, so I can't let you go that early. I want to shift gears and talk a little bit about U.S. involvement in World War I. Okay? So again, this handout is available. I don't know if you printed it off. If you did, that's okay. But I want to start this discussion because we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about World War I in the course. Okay? All right. U.S. involvement in the First World War. This is going to be, the culmination of what we've been talking about so far, this new diplomacy and foreign policy here. This is the greatest foreign policy crisis of our history, the First World War. So this is a complicated war in many regards, and we need to sort of think about, at first, the political situation in Europe. There's going to be a lot of European history in this particular lecture here, because to understand the war, we have to think about what's going on in Europe at the time. Right? The war begins in 1914 and will conclude in 1918. So for 4 years, most of Europe, as well as about 100 countries around the world, are going to get involved in this conflict. Right? It is the first great general conflict of the 20th century. And the irony of this is that as we believe we are advancing civilization and becoming more and more civilized, we actually become much more violent over the course of the 20th century. Right? Now, this is a look at the map of Europe at the beginning of the war in 1914. And the country that we're going to spend most of the time on here, two countries, England and Germany, but Germany specifically. We have to think about what's going on here. So here's Germany here. A couple of things that we want to think about here. Germany, first of all, What country is older, Germany or the United States?
Germany.
Wrong. Just confused look. Germany is a brand new country. It was formed in 1870, about 100 years after the United States. Right? Now, German Central Europe, Germanic culture, Germanic states, those have been around for hundreds of years, if not back to the Middle Ages, 1,000 years. Okay? But you can't confuse all of this German culture with the nation of Germany. All right? And this is going to bring up what we call nationalism as a major cause of this war. Nationalism. All right? Now, Germany was created. I'm just curious if they're here, so no, never mind. Just want to see where I was going with that. I thought I had a slide in there, I didn't. Okay. Germany was created in 1870, 71, out of a war between several Germanic states, most importantly the state of Prussia, which is most of this part of Germany. This is Prussia, one of the German states, it's like Texas, against a war against France. And they beat France pretty good. All right? And when Germany declared the creation, its existence, right, is born out of a war, they do so not even in Germany, but they did it in Paris. Actually, they did it in Versailles, right, the Palace of Versailles outside of Paris. That is, while they are have their boots on the neck of the French, they then declare, now we are created as a new nation, Germany. Prior to that, it was, again, places like Prussia, Bavaria, Mecklenburg, Bohemia. These are all German states, and they all united together to create this new nation. And if you want to kind of boil down the base, oversimplification, but still very accurate, of what the principal cause of World War I was, it is Europe coming to terms with this new powerful Germany. Because Germany is absolutely the most powerful nation in all of Europe compared to any other one nation. All right? It is, again, one of the most industrialized nations. As the United States is industrialized in that late 19th century, Germany already was industrialized. They are going to go into tremendous expansion around the world. Again, notice those conflicts that we were having in the Pacific. Samoa involved the German Navy. They have the #2 Navy in the world. And the point is that this is a very powerful political entity, economic entity, that Europe is trying to figure out how to deal with. All right? So this is what the main cause of of World War I was what do you do with this new powerful Germany? All right? Now, this term nationalism, what does that mean? Well, nationalism is this idea. Oh, sorry, I had a question.
Oh, sorry.
Nationalism is this idea that all of the people that share a common culture, language, identity, general religious uniformity, tied to certain geography, should all unite together, right, to form one political entity. That's what nationalism is. And you have all of these various German states, independent of each other, but all German culture, coming together in 1870 to unite together to create this powerful Germany. Right? Now the problem with nationalism is it can be warped into a lot of different things, like patriotism. Right? Again, there's nothing wrong with patriotism, but when you talk about nationalism and patriotism, loyalty, what you also begin to hear is how your country, this is what nationalism does, is better than other countries. There becomes this certain sense of superiority here. Right? And this sort of push for nationalism, and again, Germany is the first real country to do this in the late 19th century, is going to encourage a lot of other cultures, or what we would call nations, groups of people, same identity, culture, but not officially recognized as new countries. They also want what Germany has. Now, maybe, again, not in terms of power and economic development, but recognition as independent nations, right? So Germany, by creating itself the way it did, unleashes a floodgate of other cultures wanting to do the same thing. And the point we would make is that this map is going to look very different after World War I, because all sorts of new countries are going to be created. Germany itself eventually is going to be broken up a little bit. Russia's going to lose territory. So this whole Austro-Hungarian Empire there in the middle will completely be broken up. And all of these various multi-ethnic political, cultural groups are going to start forming together and clamoring for recognition. So this nationalism is a big drive here in the late 19th century that's ultimately going to lead to war. Right? Now, the other thing that we need to think about is what was the immediate trigger for World War I, or the First World War? Well, it has to do with this guy here, a Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip. Now, some people would call him a patriot, a freedom fighter. Others will call him a terrorist. He's still the same person, right? So those sort of categories are based upon perspective and opinion, right? One person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter, okay? And the reason that he is considered a terrorist, and probably accurately so, but perspective, right? Is that he assassinated this guy. Okay? Now this guy here is the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Okay? Franz Ferdinand is the heir to the throne of this Austro-Hungarian Empire. Right? So you have these two very powerful political units in the middle of Europe, Central Europe, Germany, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And this guy is going to be the next emperor. And he is assassinated by Gavrilo Princip and a number of his friends as a statement, because the Austro-Hungarian Empire is occupying, possessing territory that hundreds of thousands of Serbians are living in. And they want to break away from the Austro-Hungarian Empire and be part of their own nation, Serbian nationalism, but the empire won't allow it. Right? Now, this is important to keep in mind. There is a country of Serbia at this time. But the problem is this area right next to Serbia is also full of Serbians, but it's under Austro-Hungarian control. And in the city of Sarajevo, right there, in modern-day Bosnia, the Archduke visiting the city, troops, inspections, these sort of things, was assassinated, right? They threw a bomb in his car and killed him and his wife, right? So now this is what we call the trigger mechanism to start the war. But we have to keep in mind that this trigger mechanism really just sets off long-standing competition that was just building and building and building, and it just needed a spark to start it. All right? So the assassination of the Archduke is the trigger, but the principal causes, how do you deal with this new Germany? And even more specifically, this goes back to empire of industrial nations. Because what is happening in the late 19th century as the United States is engaging in Spanish-American War, Philippines, Guam, Midway, Puerto Rico, that is, as we are acquiring territory, again, mostly islands, England, again, the Great Britain, the British Empire, excuse me, and Germany are in a tremendous sort of competitive struggle to acquire natural resources around the world. And the principal areas that they go to are Africa and Asia. Remember we were saying about them being in China, right? Remember the British are in India. And particularly in the late 19th century, Africa is heavily colonized by the British and the Germans, to some extent the French, to some extent the Belgians, but primarily the British and the Germans. And we're going to think about that for just a moment. This is called the Scramble for Africa. And in 1878, roughly about that time of industrialization in the United States, Very few countries, very few territories in Africa, just some of the coastal territories, are possessed by the Europeans. By 1914, on the eve of this war, every country in Africa is controlled by Europeans except for two, Liberia and Ethiopia. So the point is, in almost one generation, the entire continent is taken over by Europeans. The same basic principle is happening in Asia as well, East Asia. Right? Now, one of the things that we want to just go back to is this consequence of industrialization on the world. It's not just the United States here that is dealing with this. England and Germany as industrial nations, there is a huge demand for natural resources to feed your industrial engines back home. Now that's the problem here, is that, the United States kind of sets back and go, yeah, we took Cuba, but Philippines, I mean, we're not like taking over Africa. Well, why are we not taking over Africa? Because what they did to Africa, we did to the Native Americans. We have this massive real estate here. Notice England and Germany, these are small little countries, right? They don't have the luxury of having the west of the United States with all that mining and natural resources out there. If we didn't have that, we would have found it some way, somehow, right? That's what powerful nations do, powerful empires do. So again, we kind of sit back with this, you bad Europeans, right? But we're basically have done it already by taking it from Native Americans, right? So we have most of those natural resources already, but the English and the British, and the Germans do not, right? So this scramble for Africa is really about competition for natural resources. And why are they competing for resources? Because of industrialization. They have to feed those engines back home, right? So it is leading to more and more competition. And that's the sort of, again, this building block of World War I here that just simply needs a spark to start it off. And that's what the assassination did, right? Because the assassination is the first domino to fall over in a chain of events that's going to drag Europe into the First World War. All right? So let's think about this for just a moment, the principal players in this war. We have two groups of people or countries. The Central Powers, and this is again from a U.S. perspective, the Central Powers and the Allied Powers. Why do we call them the Allied Powers? Because eventually we join that side, so they're our allies. Right? Well, first of all, one of the principal players here is the Austro-Hungarian Empire. When Gabriel Princip, a Serbian, assassinated the Archduke, the heir to the empire, what does Austro-Hungarian Empire want more than anything else now? Revenge. But it's not just revenge. What it really is the pretext to expand your empire. Now they can claim justification in not just occupying this territory in southern Europe that Serbians live in. They can now justify an invasion of Serbia, the nation of Serbia itself. And that's exactly what they begin to do. They are gearing up for a war to punish Serbia and try to annex it into the empire. And they have just cause, again, understandable just cause, with this assassination attempt. Now, what this does, when we say that's the first domino that falls over, is that it brings in all of these various alliances that the European nations have with themselves, and everybody is not exactly sure who is on whose side here, but you activate one of them, it's the tripwire that others then get pulled in. So the Austro-Hungarian Empire gears up for war. They're going to smash Serbia. They do go to Germany and say, you guys got a problem with this? Germany says, no, go ahead. But if you're going to threaten Serbia, that brings in nations that have alliances with Serbia. Now remember, this is Eastern European. These are Slavic peoples. What big nation might have an issue with with Austro-Hungary flexing its muscles? Russia, absolutely. Now, here's the problem with Russia. There are many of them. One, it's not an industrialized nation. What we do in the 1870s and 80s, they won't be able to do that till the 1930s. So that's later. Okay? So it's an unindustrialized nation. And here's the problem from Russia's perspective. they're not quite so concerned about Austro-Hungary, although that's an issue, but they're more concerned about Germany. Again, as all of these nations are, right? And they know that Austro-Hungary and Germany are buddies, okay? So the problem here is that Germany, long story short, Germany, well, how do we say this? Germany has humiliated Russia time and time again over the last 30 years in small little regional conflicts in Eastern Europe, in the Balkans, around Turkey, parts of the Crimean War. And the point is that the Russians are they're fed up with that, right? And they want to stand up to this new powerful Germany, right? Well, but they're not an industrialized country. So the biggest problem that all of these countries are going to face, but none more so than Russia, is how long it takes to mobilize for war. When I say mobilize for, that means get ready for war. Draw up troops, build up your supplies, start getting equipment together, draw up your war plans, all of these sorts of things. That takes an incredible amount of time, particularly for an unindustrialized country like Russia. It takes a lot for all countries, but more so for Russia. And again, they have a massive army. They have a massive geography that they have to deal with, right? So as Austro-Hungarian Empire is posturing for war against Serbia, the Russians are going to come to the aid of the Serbians, and again, not necessarily for Serbia, but because they want to strike back against Germany after all these years of humiliation. So they call for a general mobilization of war, right? That basically means they are preparing for war. And when one country does that, all the other countries are going to have to follow suit, okay? Because one of the problems here, for industrialized or unindustrialized, mobilization is a complicated process. But the biggest sort of bottleneck here is transportation. The ability to get your troops to a battlefield, get to a region of Europe, that is something that is a very slow and cumbersome process. And the problem is that if one country begins to mobilize for war and you don't, then they may get ready and attack before you can defend yourself, right? And you'll be too late by the time you do it. And that's the problem. And the Russians know that. They had better get started on this process, but when they do, other nations begin to do the same thing. And that's why Germany then comes in and prepares for war. And they're going to join, obviously, again, Central Powers. This is Central Europe, Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Germany. Now, Germany is not terribly concerned with Russia. You got to deal with them, but they're not the big threat. Their big threat, not the British, but the French. The French. It'll be the British in a moment, but not them. Not now. Because obviously they don't share a border, but they're very close. And they know that as Russia is mobilizing for war, France is going to come to the aid of Russia. Long-standing political ties between France and Russia. All right? So now France then has to mobilize for war. Okay? Now, the other big nation that we haven't talked, and again, there are hundreds of them involved. I'm not talking about the United States. We don't get involved until 1917. We get at the very end of this war. But the other big nation is England, right? Now, the question is, England, they try to take the high ground here in terms of why they're coming to war, going to war. And it has to do with Germany and their Germany's first move, okay? Germany's first move is not to concern themselves as much with Russia as the greater threat, which is France. But and again, Germany and France, they share a border. Remember this long-standing hostility for out of this war, the Franco-Prussian War, that the French were defeated. In the 1870s, Germany was created. Is that? We tend to think of these Germans. Think about World War I, World War II, Franco-Prussian. This very extreme militarism, punishing France, conquering them, and all. In many ways, they're just doing what France had done to them with this guy named Napoleon, right? Who came in and wiped out, he threatened to wipe Prussia completely off the map. So again, this kind of long-standing French-German conflict has been going on for a while here. Germany figures, okay, the first thing we got to do is deal with France before we get too involved in the war here. And this border right here, right? They share a common border, but this is the Rhineland, right? This is the Rhine River. Very difficult terrain, mountainous rivers, very difficult to move soldiers and troops and equipment. But look, here's the nice flat plains, easily cross into France, but there's a problem. You've got to go through Belgium to do it. Belgium is a neutral country. And neutral countries are going to be, the status of neutral countries in the First World War is very important. We'll have to pay attention to that because we're going to be a neutral country. All right, so we're going to be very concerned about what happens to neutral countries. But Belgium is a neutral country. Don't want to get involved in this war. But Germany invaded and ran through Belgium because it made sense to get to France. Well, now this is when England steps in. Because England, concerned about these poor neutral Belgians, says we are going to declare war against Germany to come to the aid of a neutral country like Belgium. Now, does England care about Belgium? No, they don't care about Belgium. It's the pretext to justify going to war. Nobody is more concerned about Germany than England. Nobody. Now, the two, and think about that for just a moment. In terms of colonial empire, Britain is number one, the British Empire, but Germany is right there with them. It is their great colonial imperial rivals. They are also industrial rivals. They also have this naval rivalry going on. And England is most concerned about Germany's colonial possessions and their navy. And the irony of this is, at the very end of this war, what does England get? They get all of Germany's possessions and they get the German navy, right? That's their agenda here, right? But the pretext is, poor defenseless Belgium, we're going to come to their aid. No, they're not coming to their aid. It's a pretext for war. Okay, this basically is the main powers. Again, there are many of them, others we could talk about, Italy, Japan. Obviously, we could drag in a number of other countries. But for now, these are the main players. What we need to focus on is the role of the United States in all this, and that's what we'll start with next time.